Well, good evening. Thank you for joining Gwinnett County Public Library for our Meet the Author series in celebration of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. My name is Miriam Mayer, and I am an Adult Services Specialist at Gwinnett County Public Library. Tonight, we are joined by author Adrienne Su in discussion of her new book, Peach State, with Professor Lee Brewer-Jones. Now I would like to introduce our guest for tonight. Our moderator tonight is Professor Lee Brewer-Jones. He is an English professor at Georgia State University, Perimeter College. Adrienne Su was raised in Atlanta, Georgia, and earned a BA from Radcliffe College of Harvard University and an MFA from the University of Virginia. She is the author of the poetry collections Peach State, Living Quarters, Having None of It, Sanctuary, and Middle Kingdom. Her awards include a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship and residencies at the Fine Arts Works Center and the Frost Place. In 2019, Su was awarded a grant from the Money for Women Barbara Deming Memorial Fund. Su's poems have appeared in the anthologies Asian American Poetry, The Next Generation, The New American Poets, and the Pushcart Prize 24. She currently teaches at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Please welcome Adrienne Su and Professor Lee Brewer-Jones.
Thank you so much, Miriam. I'd like to welcome you home, Adrienne. For those in the audience who don't know this, she is a native of the Atlanta area and grew up. She says in the volume Peach State, she grew up near North Lake Mall, with occasionally Stone Mountain and always Beaufort Highway, somewhere in the nearby geography. So again, welcome back. What are some particular memories of those places that you really wanted people to understand as we look through your poetry?
Memories. I think it was just, it's funny how over time, as you write over the years, you find that certain things stick. And something that has always been on my mind since my first book was suburbia, or just this feeling that suburbia is more interesting than it appears. So I think some of the memories that I think you're asking about may be very common ones of just being a kid, going to school, wandering around the neighborhood with your friends. But then as I wrote Peach State, I think I really wanted to integrate the Chinese restaurants that I hadn't known for a long time to be a subject. That was just life.
Well, you talk a lot about the ingredients that go into a restaurant and that go into the food, both in a restaurant and at home. And the first poem in the volume is one called Substitutions. What are some substitutions that some sheets you might want to share? And on a more personal nature, what are some of the substitutions that you felt you had to make as someone of an Asian background growing up in a place that where the Asian heritage is not quite as strong, like Georgia?
Well, one of the substitutions, which is mentioned in the poem, what actually is it? I'm trying to remember now. Should I just read the poem first and then answer?
I'd be delighted. I'd hoped you would say that.
Okay. So the poem, it's the opening poem to the book, and its name is Substitutions. Balsamic for Junjang vinegar, letters for the family gathered, a Cuisinart for many hands, petty burglars for warring fans, a baby's room for tight quarters, passing cars for neighbors, lawnmower buzzing for bicycle bells, cod fillets for carp head to tail, children who overhear the language for children who speak the language, Virginia ham for Jinhua ham, and nothing for the noodle man, calling as he bears his pole down alley and street, its baskets full of pickled mustard, scallions, spice, minced pork, and a stove he lights where the customer happens to be. The balance of hot, sour, salty, sweet, which decades later you still crave. A formula he'll take to the grave. I think the substitution that came to mind when you asked the question is not in this poem, but it is in another poem. It's in the poem Abundance. And I think it's a pretty commonly known one among people who cook Chinese food in the US, which is that a lot of Chinese recipes call for Shaoxing wine. And a really good substitute for that is just a good old cheap sherry from anywhere. $3 bottle of sherry, it works just as well. And so I think that poem talks about flank steak and sort of being resourceful, and the days when flank steak was a cheap, undesirable cut of meat, which it is no longer. Now it's expensive. But that was one substitution that was very familiar to me. But I think your question was also a little more layered than that, or a lot more layered than that. And so substitutions, as an Asian person growing up in a place where there were very few Asian people, well, one of the things was that I didn't know that we were making substitutions because I was born into that context. So oddly, I think it was the strangeness or the feeling of something having been substituted for something else was the sort of gradual dawning of what might actually be Chinese. I mean, there were some things that were obviously Chinese, such as the language or certain foods that were just clearly Chinese, but there were other foods that I really didn't know whether they were Chinese or American or specifically Southern among American foods, because it was just food. You know, when you're a child, you don't always know. You do realize that when you go over to your non-Chinese friends' houses, there are some things you don't see, and vice versa. So I wish I could give a kind of nice bulleted list of substitutions, but I think it was a larger and very slow realization of what indeed was a substitution that I think would be my answer to that question. And I probably would have given you a very different answer back then. You know, asked that question then, I would probably take it literally and say, well, we couldn't find, and I didn't cook as a child or really for much of my teenage years either. So I didn't even know what substitutions were being made. They just happened. But I think that was why I got fascinated later and delved into these cookbooks from the years of my childhood to find out what Chinese Americans were cooking in places like Atlanta, where you couldn't get all the supplies as you could in San Francisco.
Right. Well, you talk a lot. I mean, of course, the book being called Peach State is a double play off the traditional name for Georgia, and also about the fact that it is a book so much infused with food and beverage. But also you talk a lot about your Asian heritage. And I was wondering if you don't resist labels, if you would think of yourself more as a Southern poet who happens to be Asian American, or an Asian American poet who happens to be from the South, or something different from either of those?
I think it kind of depends on what book I'm thinking about, because I'd say my first book had a lot about Asian American identity in it, But then the second book, not so much. The third, not so much. So, and also Southern identity didn't figure so much, I think, in Sanctuary, or so my second book, Sanctuary, my third book, Having None of It, and my fourth book, Living Quarters, they all didn't wrestle very much with Southernness. But I would say Asian American identity was always present, but not always being written about. So I think it kind of depends. I mean, I think in Peach State, I feel very much like an Asian American poet of the New South, if that's an acceptable answer, right? Just to say that being an Asian American from Atlanta now is not unusual. And yet the book dwells on a time when it was. So I guess I'm a poet whose emphasis changes depending on what I'm thinking and writing about.
I would say that's a fairly typical experience that people have as we gain maturity and perspective. And you talked about, I noticed when you were reading Substitutions, you talked about taking a formula to the grave, and you also talked about a balance between or among hot, sour, salty, and sweet. Mm-hmm. Some of the hot, sour, salty, and sweet things that you've clung to that maybe you're not going to take to the grave, but that you might be willing to share with us tonight.
Great, that's such a great question. And I'll take each of those flavors one at a time and see what occurs to me. I just love that question. So hot. What's funny is that I grew up pretty much without spicy food in the home because both of my parents grew up in regions of China where the food is more really, I think, sweet than hot. And there was usually in a lot of restaurants, Chinese restaurants, especially the later ones that were having a larger Chinese clientele, you get a little saucer of chili oil. And I was always warned about it. And so somehow hot didn't figure, but I love spicy food, and it has, I'm not sure, I think it just became part of my life as my world got bigger, you know, as I went to different places, and I was always curious about unfamiliar foods. So hot, at least in terms of spice, was an acquisition. And then sour, I think of those Chinese dried plums that are wrapped in several layers usually. I think there's a cellophane layer on the, like around the actual dried plum, and then paper layer, and then there's an outer wrapper. This is just my memory of it. It's been a long time since I've had one actually. But they're super sour, and you really have to just sort of nibble it bit by bit. It's really great with a cup of tea. Somehow we had those when I was a child, even though there weren't really that many Asian groceries available. I think it's because they're preserved. So if somebody gets you a bunch of them, you can hang on to them for a few years and just, you know, eat one when you feel like it. They're already dried. They will dry more. You can't keep them forever. But I think that's the first thing that comes to mind with sour. Salty makes me think about the structure of Chinese food, that you have the foundation of unseasoned rice, and then you put something on the rice that is generally pretty high in salt. And of course, you adjust it to your taste in terms of how much rice you eat with it. So people who really love salt will use less rice with each bite of the dish, which is, I don't think there's an English word for it. Tsai. The thing you put on the rice is tsai. And so and that's why in a Chinese banquet, sometimes there is no rice served at all. It's to show generosity. We are not going to fill you up with rice. We're just going to give you tsai, the things you put on rice. So it's going to be vegetables and meat and fish and tofu and all that good stuff that goes on the rice. It's actually, to me, quite difficult to eat a Chinese banquet meal because I kind of need some rice. And sometimes there is a little bowl of rice served at the end as a sort of symbol. But I think really about how heavily salted some Chinese food is because it is meant to be eaten with something that's unseasoned. And then sweet. I think one of the most fun things about working on this book was trying to figure out what to say about Chinese desserts, because Chinese food doesn't really have that line between savory and sweet that I think we have in the food tradition that is very France-centered. We have these glorious Western desserts because you don't have a lot of sugar in the actual meal, whereas in many cuisines, including Chinese, there's often sweet mixed in with the meal. So you're not craving it at the end, and you might just be served oranges for dessert. So I think with sweet, I think about sweet being integrated into the meal or separated from the meal. And of course, I grew up with both the Western and the Chinese food traditions. So I'm quite happy to eat cake too. Like it's so, yeah, it was interesting just now to think about those 4 taste areas. Thanks.
Well, your answer when you were speaking about sweets reminded me of the poem you talk about the 3 generations at Krispy Kreme.
Oh yeah.
Very Southern, but you gave a respectfully traditional Asian American perspective on the importance of generations being together during experience. Would you like to elaborate on how the combination of Krispy Kreme and the Chinese family operate for you in that poem or elsewhere?
Yeah, why don't I read that poem, because then anyone who's watching will have context for this. So when we walk into Krispy Kreme, we're 3 generations, same as when I was a child, only now I'm a parent. My brother's in town as well, eager for the airy snack he recalls from when the paper hats were cause for glee. My daughters are the age we were then, so it matters that they learn this part of their heritage. There's only Dunkin' where we live. My father tells the young cashier that in his day, a donut here cost a nickel, and in that instant transforms into a foreign student in Midtown Atlanta in the 50s, cut off from family, saved by study abroad, fortunate and unfortunate, receptive to barbecue, donuts, coffee, highways, football. While a hunger underlay it all for the simplest elements, steamed bread, tofu, fermented black beans, he embraced the city whose mildness and humidity mirrored home. He liked the optimism of those around him who seemed not to have eaten bitter, as the idiom goes, even though some of them had. America eats too much sugar, but that in its way made life fuller despite the complexities. We order more than we need because we're together, family of origin, and next generation. The cashier smiles. It's in his job description, but he looks sincere. This is the culture that created us. Hospitality, respect for elders. So your question was about an Asian American perspective on Krispy Kreme, right? And for me, what was happening toward the end of writing this poem was that Southern culture and Chinese culture were merging. That I felt that there in Southern culture is also a respect for elders and of course, hospitality, right? That just kind of seems like it's always attached to Southernness. And so I think food is so central to Chinese hospitality that it seemed, and I wasn't planning this. Of course, I was, as I write a poem, I'm just kind of figuring out what words are the ones I want to use to understand this encounter. But I think hospitality is so often pinned to Southernness, and respect for elders is so often pinned to Chineseness. But I felt that in that scene, the cashier is being respectful to the elderly customer who tells him how much less a donut cost, back in what, 1953 or something. Actually, I don't know what year Krispy Kreme was founded. It's possible that my father was there before Krispy Kreme. I don't know.
No, I actually know the answer to that question.
Oh, great.
About 1930 in Charlotte, North Carolina. We think it's an institution, but it's really North Carolinian.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
I said we think of it as an Atlanta institution, really North Carolinian.
Okay, so then my father did not get there ahead of Krispy Kreme.
That's right.
So it was well established when he arrived. Okay, and I love this because in writing this book, I was trying to imagine my parents' lives before me, right? Or before I was aware. So I was fascinated by things like this. Like what was there? What was in Atlanta when they first got there as foreign students? And I love knowing from you that Krispy Kreme was already there, right? And so my dad really was an old timer because this young cashier is, he is maybe, we don't know because it's just encountering a stranger, but maybe he doesn't know the history of the place where he works or the history of the neighborhood where this Krispy Kreme is. So for me, it was, I think, the moment where my dad says, a donut here used to cost a nickel. And that just sends my imagination into a whole other world because a nickel, all right, well, how far back was that? And what else was different? And what was your life like, Dad? And so all of that starts to spin. And I think it also, as far as an Asian American or a Chinese American perspective, I started to think about the Chinese idiom to eat bitter, which is simply, the expression of to suffer. And the fact that we're basically in a sugar paradise in this poem, and yet there's been so much bitterness in the American South in the past that to me, there was something going on between bitter and sweet. And at the same time, I'm sorry I'm talking so long about this.
Not at all. Thank you for the complex answer.
So yeah, it's just that so many things like we're going into this moment for me, including the different tastes and the sense of histories colliding that yeah, like I talk too long. If you ask me, that's why I have to write a poem where I cut out a lot of the extra words. But thanks for that question.
Something I'd love to hear, if you're willing to do, is I'd love to hear Beaufort Highway, and I'm sure our audience would as well. And then I'd like to ask you a couple of things about Beaufort Highway. And one I'll go ahead and ask now in particular, and I'm kind of anticipating what you say in the poem, but you talk about home being a highway, not a driveway. And so I was going to ask if you feel like a highway really can be home. Is that something that the highway is capable, the role that the highway is capable of taking on? But anyway, answer that question if you'd be willing to. I'd love to hear you read Beaufort Highway for us.
Okay, I will do that. So, Beaufort Highway. And Beaufort Highway has an epigraph from a poem written by Langston Hughes and Richard Wright, Red Clay Blues. So first I will read their lines and then I'll read my poem. I miss that red clay, Lord, I need to feel it in my shoes. Says, miss that red clay, Lord, I need to feel it in my shoes. I want to get to Georgia because I got them red clay blues. Beaufort Highway. Before it was declared a food destination, it was my family's private destination. Most weekends we gathered there, 3 generations. The stainless pot of chrysanthemum tea would always be replenished, same as iced tea. We savored 1,000 treasures of land and sea. When my grandfather died, I was living up north. When my grandmother died, I was living up north. I resolved that no one else would die going forth. When my parents grew tired of amending red clay, they sold the house they loved and its yard of red clay. While it doesn't take a house to remember those days, it's strange to go back and pull into no driveway. What conjures our home is a 7-lane highway. So your question was about a highway as home. And maybe the first thing I'll say is that the poem, you probably heard, and you already know because you read the book, that the first rhyme in every tercet, and you can't, obviously listening to the poem, you can't hear the stanza breaks, but it's written in the tradition of the blues sonnets. So you rhyme a word with itself, and then you rhyme a word with that word for each of the stanzas until you end on a couplet. So I think the feeling of sort of wanting to talk to the blues tradition is, I think, grounded in this poem being one of loss. And I do think Peach State is motivated by an impending sense of loss, even though it's kind of a celebratory book. I think funerals are often celebrations of a person's life, right? And so it's both, it's loss and celebration. So one of the straightforward things I can say about how this poem is built is that I was thinking about the fact that my childhood home is gone. And I think this happens to a lot of people, especially Americans, because we move around so much. You don't necessarily inherit the house you grew up in. You might have moved across the country or just across town for whatever reason. So at this point, when I'm putting the poem together, I'm feeling like the house gone, because the house has been sold and my parents have moved into a retirement community. So we don't have a driveway anymore. It's more like a campus, but we always go to eat on Beaufort Highway. And that's something we did back when we lived in the house as well. So Beaufort Highway becomes the place where you feel like you've come home. Not just because of the food, but because of the people you eat with, although the three generations become a different three generations, with my grandparents gone, but my children now there. But of course, the other thing that the whole book anticipates is, the next round, right? When I'm the oldest generation, right? I don't have grandchildren, but it's just the inevitable, right? And so the sense of time taking everything away from us, and poetry being that fight against time, or the thievery of time. So the highway becomes the constant. And maybe I just wanted also to celebrate Beaufort Highway in some way, and its food.
You mentioned Beaufort Highway having 7 lanes, having had 2 lanes, are going to have who knows how many lanes one day. How do you feel about the inevitability of change, and about what is lost and about what is retained? You mentioned poetry's function in holding on to things. Can we gain things that are new, and can poetry play a role in that, and in creating our own Beaufort highways, if you will?
Yeah, I don't even know if Beaufort Highway, this is funny, when I was putting this poem together, I was trying to figure out how many lanes Beaufort Highway had. So I think I used Google Earth or something, and I just kind of was looking at it and counting, and I actually don't know if you're supposed to count the turn lane. Does that count? I don't know.
Well, and it may be gone tomorrow, so who knows?
Right. Yeah. So I feel that poetry, when it's doing what it should, and many poems don't work. I mean, I feel that I am always writing, doing the best I can, but I often feel like, oh, I tried and it didn't work. But I think when a poem works, it gives this illusion of time having been stopped. And I've been to enough memorials of poets that I have felt that chill when the poet who has died is being remembered, and various people who either knew the poet or just loved the work read some of the poems. To me, we step out of time. We're no longer concerned with that individual person's birth and death. We get a little taste of eternity, I think, because that person got the right words in the right order. So I guess, yeah, change is always going to happen. The highway is going to expand or contract. Maybe remote work will make some of the highways contract. Wouldn't that be nice? Right? But I do feel like the poem, when it's working, or when it's the right poem for you in that moment, gives you a little break from that feeling of everything constantly changing.
I don't know if you'll want to read to us. Even when you die and go to heaven, you have to change planes in Atlanta. I'd love it, of course, if you did. But even if you don't, I wanted to point out that's it's a great line, and I suspect it's more true than we realize. But and perhaps this will ask you to read it. But you work with form a lot in that poem, and I noticed that you find subtle ways of weaving form into your poems, and then sometimes writing in what seems to be not necessarily a prescribed form, but then coming back to it at other times, and as I said, in a seamless sort of way. Regarding the content of that poem, though, you keep coming back to the image of Atlanta being heaven if it's your final destination. As someone who's been away for decades, does the Atlanta area feel like a sort of heaven to you, or does that feel like sort of just a nostalgic notion, or something else? And as I said, if you would love to, if you'd be happy to read this poem now, we'd be glad to hear it.
So, as I think you've already said, the title is Even When You Die and Go to Heaven, You Have to Change Planes in Atlanta. If your final destination is the ATL, welcome home. You're already in heaven. If you're bound for Huntsville, Valdosta, or Charleston, it'll take a bit longer from where you sickened or fell. Stop by for an ultimate supper at the Varsity Grill. Haunt the plane train, pride of Hartsfield Jackson. Even if your final destination is the ATL, welcome home. You're already in heaven. Your card will not be charged for this airport hotel. We have unlimited flights should you miss your connection. If by mistake you packed liquids or weapons, set them aside. We'll divert them to hell. And if your final destination is the ATL, welcome home. You're already in heaven. This poem is in a received form, but I've forgotten which form it is. I don't know if you know.
I believe it's a villanelle. I'm not. The three repeating. I'd have to look that up.
Yeah. I can't remember what it is. It's not a villanelle, but it's in that family, I think.
Okay.
Cousin. I can't remember which one. It's not a form I use a lot.
Right.
But I guess that tells you something too about process. That like I use a form because it helps me get the words right. But then I don't really care what it's called, right? It's like if it worked, then I hope it worked. But you asked a great question about Atlanta as heaven. And this is one reason, you also asked about poetic form. And this is one reason I love to write in forms, because I can say, well, the form forced me to say heaven this many times because it required me to repeat these lines. And I think whenever you invoke heaven, hell isn't that far away. I feel like I needed to, when I was writing this poem, I wondered if there's a version of the saying where they say hell instead of heaven. I think there was a real kind of existential anxiety going into this, even though the poem is, kind of making jokes, like airport jokes. And what does make Atlanta sort of heavenly for me is that most of my time there is time with family, away from the sort of mundane repetitions of maintaining a house and making a living. I mostly go there to see people I enjoy and eat great food. When my kids were little, go to the aquarium. It was kind of a little paradise. But I think my other view of heaven is one thing I think about a lot, or thought about a lot while writing Peach State, was that if you grow up in a place and then you leave, then your memory of that place is your memory of being a child there. So that place is then sort of characterized by what your childhood was like. So I felt very safe and secure as a child. And I think, well, what if I had lived my adult life there and just had to fend for myself as just an ordinary person, as I have done in other places? It probably wouldn't feel so heavenly. It would feel more realistic. Part of the motivation for writing the whole book is really my own suspicion of nostalgia. So, and I feel that that's an American worry. It's probably a worry everywhere, that people think that the good old days were better than they were. Or if people are feeling resistant to change, then the past looks less complicated maybe than it was. So maybe that's why I wanted to get that line in about diverting your liquids or weapons to hell, that like you don't have a heaven without a hell, right? So there has to be, well, I guess you could have heaven and earth. Isn't that might be the Chinese view? Like there's heaven and there's earth. There's not really hell, right? I mean, you don't have to have it. And I think there are many there are many traditions in which hell isn't a thing. But the idea of paradise here is, I hope, complicated by a kind of bureaucratic voice, the voice of the intercom. You know, when you're in the airport, the Atlanta airport, and you hear that robotic voice on the train, or you hear all these announcements, inevitably you get to your gate and find out that your flight has been moved to another gate and it's in a different terminal to get back on the train. So I didn't want heaven to seem too idyllic.
It also happens that your flight is so delayed or is so late coming in that you miss your next flight and have to go to the hotel where your credit card is not charged, as you said in the poem. And I couldn't help but ask, does that come from a place of experience or from someone else's experience that you are sharing with us?
Well, being a person who's generally had a home base in Atlanta and not had to change planes there that much, except when I happened to change planes there on my way, between two other cities, I haven't had to do that airport hotel in Atlanta. But I was thinking more about the sort of sinister aspect of dying and heading to, your ultimate destination, but having this layover, right? Where, yes, your first flight was delayed so much, you have to stay in this hotel. And of course, you're not going to be charged because you're no longer in that world you knew. So I wanted it to be a little darker than the actual experience of the airline paying for your hotel because they made you miss your connection.
That's right. But well, you also mentioned wondering if there's a version of the saying that when you die, if you go to hell, you'll have to change planes in Atlanta. And I think that it's Ann Tyler in The Accidental Tourist who uses that version of the line. I'll have to be double checked on that, but I was thinking about that while you were speaking. And I know that I have heard it, and I think that's the source. Ann Tyler, The Accidental Tourist. I'm almost certain it's an Ann Tylerism, whether it comes from Accidental Tourist or not. You talk in the poem Abundance, which you were talking about just a few minutes ago, the poem for the audience that deals with flank steak at a time when it was inexpensive, and you talk about it as nutrition for hungry students. So one of the last questions I want to ask, and this is my hint to the audience, that if you have questions, now is a great time to enter them. We're coming up on quarter until the hour, and I'll be reading questions from the box if there aren't any there yet, but please do share them with us. But my question, as we come up on that time, has to do with any nourishment that you or anything that you might want to feed to hungry students. any nourishment you might want to offer for someone who wants to learn how to be a better poet and how to write more effectively. Now, I know you devote entire semesters and even years to teaching students that, but is there any thing that might come from an elevator type conversation that you'd be willing to share with our audience tonight?
The thing I'm always urging people to do, and I'm glad that I have to do this because it's very easy to forget it yourself or to get out of practice, is to turn off your inner editor for a while. I think we get so critical of ourselves and edit as we write, just because we can see what's wrong with that first draft even before it's finished. So I think the important thing is to try to regain or maintain a sense of play and let yourself write whatever you're going to write. Don't worry how it's going to turn out, and then come back to it with your editorial brain on.
Do you turn the editorial brain on with the second draft, or you go through multiple drafts before engaging that part of your mind?
Oh, great question too. I think it depends on how unformed that first draft is. And usually it's quite unformed. So then I try also to withhold judgment somewhat for the second draft. I think it starts to kick in already because you can already see things you want to change. But if that first draft is really unsure of what it wants to do, then I don't want to impose too much on the second draft, because I might be getting it wrong. But I'd say by the third, I can start pushing it around a bit. Or I give up, right? It might be, okay, I just don't know what to do with this. I think it wasn't going to go anywhere.
When you give up, do you discard or do you put it aside for the moment and possibly come back to it later?
I still put it aside. So I guess it's not actually giving up. It's a kind of postponement, but possibly indefinite postponement.
Right.
Yeah.
When you start the process, do you tend to start with pen or pencil, or do you tend to start at the keyboard?
Pen usually, but pencil if there's not a pen available. Sure. Yeah, I do like to start with that tactile experience of writing on paper.
Tactile, you specifically like to feel the relationship between your mind and the words as they flow out of you in a way that you perhaps can't feel on a keyboard?
It's very different. Yeah, I think because it's slower than the keyboard, I consider the words a little bit longer word by word.
Because you have to, right?
Right. So it just turns out differently.
At what point, if any, do you go to the keyboard with a poem?
Pretty soon. I would say after the maybe first two drafts, possibly. I mean, if I feel like it can get some order, then
when it starts to feel like a poem, is that a...
Yeah, or when it starts to feel like a potential poem.
Okay.
Yeah.
First question has come in I'd like to read from the audience, and that is, who is your favorite contemporary poet at the moment? And along with that, what do you think is the role of contemporary poetry and culture today?
Who's my... Okay, I never have a favorite poet. But I can, let's see, and I always blank on what I've just read, but let's see, there were some really terrific poets I recently had visit my classes over Zoom. So I'll just name a few contemporary poets I think are fantastic. Rick Barrett is one. Victoria Chang, Louise Glick. You can't miss Louise Glick right after the Nobel Prize. But I've always found her work really haunting. And even though I work in rhyme and she works in free verse, I just have always felt an affinity with her poems. And let's see, who else have I've just realized I've set up this new Zoom area and it's far away from the books. But I know that there's some others that I've recently enjoyed, and I'm just trying to remember what books they are. Oh, Sandra Beasley, Made to Explode, which came out last year. And I also had Shara McCallum visit my class over Zoom. Her newest book is really a novel in verse, imagining Robert Burns if his life had gone differently. That's a few. And then let's see, the other part of the question was.
The other part of the question had to do with how you see the role of contemporary poetry today.
Okay, yeah, right. I think it is to say the truth as the poet understands it, and then try to get it to stick around. Right? I mean, I think in times of crisis, we do as a society often turn to poems. I think after 9/11, there was a surge of interest in poems that were not written in the wake of 9/11, but after World War II, or like a poem addresses a human truth or a human experience in a larger sense. It'll be about a specific one, but it's going to work for another crisis. So I think it is to attempt to capture something true about being alive that people will be able to connect to in a different circumstance. And I think most contemporary poetry gets very little attention, but its job isn't to get attention now necessarily.
To me, that sounds a bit Keatsian. Are you influenced by Keats?
Not as much as I mean, only because of my own failure. But I mentioned Rick Barrett a minute ago, and I love the way Rick Barrett uses Keats. And so if that is helpful, I don't know if that is as an answer to your question, but I do wonder, I don't know if I'm saying that beauty is truth, right? Or if truth is beauty.
While we wait for another question to come in from the audience, I wanted to ask, pertaining to the question about contemporary poets, who are some of the poets from the past who have inspired you?
Well, okay, so I'm seeing this wonderful remark in the Q&A box from an old classmate who was in my Latin class at Lakeside. And the reason I bring that up now is that I kind of had my introduction to meter and rhyme through Latin. So really the first poets I really engaged with, or really poet, I guess, was Virgil. I mean, I felt like I got my education in meter from the classics, as in classical antiquity. I don't know that I did it that well because we didn't really have upper level Latin. I just sort of sat in the back of second year Latin and did my best to translate. But I felt that I got absorbed in that.
And I also see the question that has popped up about art, and you mentioned very quickly something about artwork. Anything you care to add to that comment?
Oh, well, first I'll answer that comment. Let's see. Oh, I'll say thank you on behalf of my daughter on the artwork. But I realized after teaching Natasha Trethewey's work and having her visit my class over Zoom that I really like other people's ekphrastic poems, but I almost never write one myself, and I don't know why. I use the college art gallery a lot for my students, and they really respond to writing poems that engage with works of art. But I'm not sure that I have really done it, and I actually think that is. I take that question almost as like a useful suggestion, right? Because after reading a lot of Trethewey's poems that respond to art, I just thought I need to do this more. I admire other people doing it. I encourage other people to do it, but maybe I'm just the teacher too much of the time. I kind of need to be a student and do that more, because I think it does bring other things out.
If you don't mind my asking, what are you working on now? And when do you see your next book being finished, if it's not already in fact finished? I know people have to work ahead of the publishers timelines.
Yeah, well, I'm not that fast. I'm trying to work on something to do with the theme of memory, and sort of memory loss, and sort of that line between imagination and memory. I know that shares some territory with Peach State. So part of one reason I'm not that close, I don't know when I will have the next book, is that I'm trying really hard not to repeat myself. So I got so caught up in writing Peach State that it became a world that I could enter. I got really comfortable there. And I could still be working on it, if I didn't have to at some point declare it finished, right? I just so, I felt so at ease, but also alive in that imaginative space, that what I've been doing is trying to get out of it, because I don't want to do the same thing. I always have periods of silence after finishing a book. And so I would say that since really kind of, no longer making any corrections to the Peach State manuscript, I've written more essays and poems here and there, but they don't cohere yet.
Well, I'm sure they will. And I'll admit I should have been introduced to your work earlier, because I subscribe to the New Yorker, and so I should have seen. And I encourage everybody in the audience to go and have a look at After an Hour, You're Hungry Again, because it's wonderful. It made me hungry. I want to read the next volume that comes along, and I see that Miriam has popped back up. And so, Miriam, I think you're going to conclude the program for us.
Yes. Thank you so much, Professor Lee. Thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you to Adrienne and to Professor Lee for this wonderful discussion. This book is a beautiful tribute to immigrant culture colliding with Southern culture and Atlanta culture, and food being the thing that connects these cultures and mixes them into the the New South, which is what I know to be today. So, and I personally loved that you wrote about Beaufort Highway, which is so culturally diverse and where I also call home. So thank you for writing about that. Again, thank you everyone for attending, and we hope that you have a great evening.